Today we're going to talk about nutrition of the cow herd and implications for reproductive performance, fetal development, and calf performance. The first thing we need to understand is that there is a hierarchy of nutrient use. And this hierarchy goes from maintenance to development to growth to lactation to reproduction to fattening. And what this means is if nutrients are limiting for, let's say, development, no growth will occur. And nutrients for growth are used before nutrients for lactation, and nutrients for lactation are used before reproduction. In the dairy industry, with the high lactation demands, we get increased postpartum anestrus. We call it lactational anestrus. That's the concept here. So I want to discuss beef cattle today, and I want to cover the 4 physiological stages of the production of the cow. In the following example, because in the US we have both spring calving and fall calving, I have examples for fall calving with September 1, those are shown in black, and for spring calving on January 1, and those are shown in green. The first stage is the first 82 days after calving. This would be September 1 to November 1 in the fall calving herd, and January 1 to March 23rd in a winter spring calving herd. This cow has 4 basic functions in stage 1: lactation, uterine involution, ovulation, and conception. This is the period of the highest nutritional requirements of that animal, and postpartum anestrus averages 60 days. Remember that hierarchy of nutrient use: maintenance, development, growth, lactation, reproduction, and fattening. We need to feed the best feeds possible during this time so that the cow can go through all of these 4 basic functions so that she can rebreed within the first 82 days to calve on the same date the following year. The second stage is days 83 to 205, which goes right up to weaning. For a fall calving herd, that would be November 22nd to March 24th, and for a spring calving herd, March 24th to July 24th. The cow has 3 basic functions in stage 2. She has to lactate, she has to maintain the pregnancy, and this is the time that she needs to put weight back on. These animals are the most efficient when they are lactating, and it's always cheaper to have the animal harvest its own feed. If feed is limiting, if forage is limiting, we need to utilize optimal calf nutrition programs such as creep feeding. In extreme situations, we may practice early weaning, where we may need to feed some supplementation to the cow, but that is by far the last choice. During stage 3, which occurs right after weaning, we have days 206 to 315. For a fall calving herd, that would be March 25th to July 12th, and for a spring calving herd, that would be July 25th to November 11th. The cow has 2 basic functions in stage 3. She has to maintain herself and she has to maintain her pregnancy. I call this the make or break period because we need to focus on cost savings. We need to maximize the use of cow harvested forage. In a spring calving situation, we need to utilize fall regrowth or crop residues. And quite frankly, if your forage management was good, you should be able to feed the poorest quality hay during stage 3. What you don't want to do, because it increases costs to the overall production, is you don't want to have to be buying purchased feed to put weight back on a cow before she goes into stage 4. Stage 4 is days 316 to 365. For a fall calving animal, that's July 13th to August 31st. And for that animal that's going to calve on January 1, that's November 12th to December 13th. This is the period immediately pre-calving, and we need to understand that colostrum is produced the last 5 weeks. In the summer, what this means is that we have to undergo heat stress mitigation during this period of time for a fall calving cow. This is the second highest nutritional requirement period of the 4 stages. The cow has 3 basic functions. She needs to provide nourishment to allow the majority of fetal growth, which averages about 9/10 of a pound per day. She has to prepare for calving, and she has to prepare for lactation. Use the best feed possible at this time. So let's look at just this last trimester. It's the period of the fastest volume of growth for the calf. We have nutrient transfer from the dam to the fetus. The last 5 weeks of pregnancy, we have colostrum production. That cow has to prepare for lactation, and we need to consider how fast she's going to rebreed. In order to optimize things, the optimal body condition score is between a 5 and a 6. If we can stay within this range, cattle will rebreed very effectively. So I have some calving date messages now. If you calve in September 1, heat stress mitigation during the last trimester is a major issue, as August is the time that colostrum is produced. And if cows are stressed, calves will have a weakened immune system and reduced growth potential. In the spring calving situation, if you calve on January 1, having improved forage digestibility of harvested forage is required, and you need to have good reproductive performance and reduced postpartum interval. So in the summer, we're trying to mitigate heat. In the winter, we're trying to improve forage digestibility. So let's look at a little bit of work done with body condition and the impacts that have on reproductive performance and calf performance. This is an older study, but it's very effective at demonstrating the impacts of body condition scoring. With a body condition score 3, the pregnancy rate of cattle following calving was only 43%. That went up to 93% as we go to a body condition score 6. So that body condition score 5, 5.5, or 6 is where we need to be. You also see that there was a reduced calving interval with body condition score 5 or 6. The calf weight gain prior to weaning was highest, and weaning weight was 140 pounds more than with the body condition score 3. All economically important measurements. From the calf standpoint, we need to look at colostrum and passive immunity. As I said earlier, colostrum is produced in the last 5 weeks, and a thin cow is going to produce less colostrum and colostrum with lower levels of antibodies, which will reduce the calf's ability to mount an immune response. We have to remember that calves are born with no immune system. Their immune system doesn't really start to develop until about 150 days. And up to that point in time, we have colostral immunity. The amount and timing of colostrum is critical, and the calf should get 200 grams in the first 12 hours and up to 400 grams before the first 24 hours. There's 454 grams in a pound, so that works out to be about a pound. An adequately nourished beef cow should produce sufficient antibodies to provide an appropriate level of passive immunity in about 3 liters of colostrum. So what this really means is that calves should consume 1 pint of colostrum for every 20 pounds of calf weight. I want to switch gears a little bit now and talk about forages and carbohydrate digestion. We need to understand that starch and cellulose are both made up of a glucose molecule. The only difference between starch is that starch has an alpha linkage and cellulose has a beta linkage. This slide just shows what these different linkages are. And the reality of it is the rumen bacteria that utilize cellulose that are able to break these beta bonds, which is why ruminants are able to digest forages and derive energy from those forages. Whereas humans and pigs and non-ruminants can only utilize starch. So this is a really important slide for calf and cow nutrition. This is the effect of forage to concentrate ratio in the diet on rumen VFA production. If I look at my top left and I have a forage to concentrate ratio of 100% forage, I get about 70% acetate at about 16% propionate and about 8% butyrate. As I move on down to a high grain, low forage diet with 20% forage, 80% grain, what I get is 50% acetate, 30% propionate, and about 10% butyrate. The importance of understanding how this impacts an animal is really critical, because if I look at VFA use in ruminants, acetate from a high forage diet is primarily used in fatty acid synthesis for back fat, seam fat, and milk fat, critical to newborn calves. Propionate is converted to glucose in the liver. Butyrate is converted to ketones during absorption through the rumen. It goes to fatty acid synthesis. Well, if we look at this a little bit closely, and we see that high grain diets, which have more starch, result in more propionate production relative to acetate. Propionate is the only VFA that's converted to glucose in the liver. Higher levels of glucose production in the liver result in a greater average gain, more lean tissue growth per day, and more intramuscular fat deposited. So, if we feed a forage-based diet that results in more acetate, what we get is an increase in back fat, seam fat, and milk fat. If we feed a high grain diet, we get more glucose, more average daily gain, more tissue growth, and more marbling. So let's look at the impact of cow health and nutrition and the impact on the calf's health and long-term productivity. If we look at developmental programming windows during gestation, what we find is that muscle development starts occurring at the early stages of mid-gestation, and muscle development is critically important and related to cow body condition and protein status, because a muscle is multinucleated. And what that really means is a muscle can have many nuclei on a muscle fiber. If an animal is undernourished, if that cow is undernourished, she's not able to provide enough protein to that fetus. Muscle development of that calf will be limited because it will not have as many nuclei on a muscle fiber, regardless of genetics. If we then switch and we look at adipose tissue or fat tissue development, that occurs starting in mid-gestation and goes on to a little while after birth. So the number of fat cells is actually set at birth. If we then look at how nutrients are partitioned in the dam, if we look at this graph that shows nutrients in the bloodstream, we see that brain and central nervous tissue from the dam get the first pull of nutrients, followed immediately by the placenta before bone, muscle, or fat development in the adult animal take place. So that fetus has a draw on nutrients from the bloodstream right after that animal meets its own maintenance requirements for brain and central nervous function. Well, what does all this really mean? I am showing here 6 different forages. These are actually forage analyses that were taken. And if you looked at these forages seem to be pretty consistent to a lot of grasses that we have, running from about 6.5% to 9% protein. So if you predict the intake on a percentage of body weight of an animal, this shows that we're going to have a cow consume about 1.5 to 1.6% of her body weight on a dry matter basis of these forages. Well, what I did is I took a 1,200-pound cow's nutritional requirements and I broke it down by stage of production, predicted protein intake, and TDN intake. In that last third of gestation and the first 4 months of lactation, the indicated in yellow on this table, these do not meet the nutrient requirements of the animal. If we look at all 6 forages, we find that only one of the forages actually met the predicted feed consumption and requirements of an animal. So what this shows is that in many cases with our forages, we need to be doing something to improve the protein status of our forages that's consumed by the animal. So one of the things I always recommend is that when a producer has forages, that they take a forage analysis. What I want you to see here, though, is that on the second line down, crude protein, on this particular sample that was corn silage, on a dry matter basis, this was 6.83% crude protein. But I want you to look down to the next line underlined in red, available crude protein, and it was only 6.25. The amount of protein that was actually available to the animal is 9% lower than the total crude protein. Protein can be bound and unavailable to the animal. So when I am thinking of a supplementation program for cows, I always use the protein percentage shown as available protein rather than crude protein. Because if I use crude protein, and I have 10% of it bound and unavailable to the animal, I'm kidding myself on how much protein that animal actually is getting. So I want to look now at some University of Nebraska research that I think is really great. This looked at cows on native range grazing corn crop residues and hay that are all in low protein availability. And this research looked at basically 2 things: supplementing the pregnant cows with protein or not supplementing the pregnant cows with protein. There were a series of studies done over several years at the University of Nebraska, and I am showing 4 of those studies here. The bars in blue are from cows with no protein supplementation. The bars in red are from cows with different protein supplementation, additional protein supplementation. What you see here is that protein supplementation of that cow during gestation resulted in greater weaning weight of calves in all 4 studies. If we followed those calves on and they looked at the steer progeny, and they looked at the percentage choice carcasses versus the percentage of upper 2/3 choice carcasses, they found that protein supplementation increased the percentage of choice carcasses. However, if we look at the upper 2/3 choice, it nearly doubled the percentage of carcasses grading in the upper 2/3 of choice. Keep in mind, the cattle that went into this, the steer progeny, they were not treated differently. This is a carryover effect, what we would call fetal programming, of their dams being supplemented with protein during gestation. If we looked at reproductive performance of the heifers, for the heifers that were born from cows that were supplemented with protein, they had a lower age at puberty, which resulted in a greater pregnancy rate in those heifers. Truly economically important. So I want to look a little bit now at forage digestibility and how we impact forage digestibility with management. I want you to keep in mind that when cattle are grazing, they choose short length forage if it's available. So this is a picture of the inside of a rumen. A rumen contents are going to average 88% water or 12% dry matter across a variety of feeds. The reason I'm showing you this is to show you the particle sizes of the forage in the rumen. So the question I ask, especially when we're feeding round bales, is how much energy does it take to reduce a particle size that's 2 or 3 feet long down to a particle size that is a ½ an inch in length? And the critical thing to remember is that feed can't exit the rumen until it's less than a ½ inch to 1 inch in length in most cases, and the majority of particles are less than a 25th of an inch in size. So the next slide shows the reticulum. And the reticulum traps feed and limits it from going on down the digestive tract. The reason I'm showing this picture is because we all know how big a kernel of corn is. And what this shows is that basically a forage particle has to be broken down to about the length of a kernel of corn in order to pass out. So what really happens if we're feeding a really mature forage with a lot of lignin? We're limiting daily energy intake by that animal because she has to regurgitate, rechew feed, chew her cud, break that forage down physically, because a lot of it is the cellulose and hemicellulose are bound to lignin, which is indigestible. So I want to think in terms of optimizing forage digestibility with gestating cows. A hay grinder or a chop cut baler are great investments. It always amazes me that we don't routinely grind hay, yet many people routinely grind corn. And corn is already 95% digestible, and hay has a digestibility that can be as low as 25 or 30%. So what are the implications of increased forage digestibility? If we increase forage digestibility by breaking that forage particle down, we get more microbial protein supply to the small intestine, which limits the amount of protein that we need to buy. We have a reduced need for protein supplementation. We get an increase in VFA production, which means an increase in energy to that animal. We get a reduction in feed waste because a cow that is pulling out a feed particle from a round bale feeder that's only 6 inches long doesn't pull as much and waste it as if she reaches in and pulls out a piece that's 2 feet long. We get greater digestibility, so we have reduced manure output. We have improved cow body condition, and we have a reduced need for overall purchased feed. So if we look at forage digestibility, I want you to understand that digestion normally occurs from the inside of the forage to the outside. And research at Penn State University showed that 20 to 70% of cellulose may never be digested at all. And limitations to the rate at which forage is digested have a lot to do with the physical properties of the forage. Higher moisture forages increase the rate of digestion. Older forages with more lignin decrease the rate of digestion. And it's important to remember that forage digestion occurs with the bacteria, and they digest a forage from the inside of the forage to the outside of the forage. So I want you, and why does that occur? Well, the outside of a forage particle is covered by a waxy cuticle layer. That wax is what prevents the forage from drying out and in the field when it is a growing grass. But bacteria cannot break through that waxy layer to get to the cellulose and the hemicellulose. So what I want you to understand right now is anything that we can do to disrupt that forage particle increases the rate of digestion, which means that our cows can get more energy intake per day by eating more. So long-stemmed hay drastically reduces digestibility, reduces energy intake, and it reduces energy available to the animal. And in addition, that animal expends more energy because she's got to regurgitate, rechew the feed until it's either broken down small enough to pass out of the reticulum or it's digested. So what I like to think of is methods to increase forage digestibility. Grinding forage during harvest, using a chop cut baler, or post-harvesting grinding can increase the digestibility by 30 to 35%. That's a tremendous increase in digestibility. I also think we need to look at feed additives that increase microbial enzyme production and forage digestibility, such as Amifirm or Levucel, or we need to look at VFA production and look at things like Rumensin or Bovatec or Amifirm that increase total VFAs. My whole concept here is in the feedlot industry, we use a lot of feed ingredients that for specific roles. In cow-calf, we have been slower to adopt this, and it limits our productivity. So this is a really critical thing to understand. To supply newborn calves with more energy, we need to increase acetate production through improved forage digestion. Acetate from increased fiber in the rumen goes to primarily to two places. It goes to milk fat and it goes to intermuscular or seam fat. With newborn calves that cannot drink a lot of milk, we don't want more milk production. This is not a dairy situation where during that early lactation, we can just take out the milk. This calf has to be able to drink it. And so what we want is we want every drink that that calf takes to have as much energy in it as possible. So if we can increase forage digestibility, we increase acetate production, which increases percent milk fat. That gives more energy to the calf. So let's look at some ways that have been tried to improve the cow's nutrition during late gestation. One study that was done, and this is over 20 years ago now, but in many parts of the country where we grow corn, corn is a relatively available and cheap source of energy supplementation. Many people who do not pay great attention to their forage and pasture utilization during the summer wean their calves in that stage 3 of production and find out that the cows are thin. And then they end up playing catch up, trying to supplement cows with more energy to put on more weight to have a greater body condition score going into the winter. Well, one study looked at feeding corn as an alternative energy source. 3 separate studies were done where they looked at either feeding hay ad libitum or limit-fed corn at about 8 to 10 pounds per head per day to reach the same energy intake of the cows consuming hay. The cattle did stay in good body condition score, but corn averaged a 6.5 pound increase in birth weight of the calves. So why does supplementing corn to pregnant cows result in an increase in calf birth weight? Corn results in more propionate production in the rumen because corn is largely starch. Propionate is converted to glucose in the liver. Glucose is absorbed by the fetus, resulting in greater fetal growth. So, looking at another study that was done, looking at late gestation. This study was done at The Ohio State University by Dr. Amy Reduns. It was her PhD research. In this particular study, there were 60 beef cows that were 3 to 6 years of age. They were assigned to one of 3 treatments. They were during gestation. They were fed either a grass legume hay, limit-fed corn, or they were fed a high-fat dried distillers grains The diets were fed beginning at 155 days of gestation, and they were provided at levels that provided the animal the exact same level of daily energy intake. This just shows the breakdown of the composition of the three different feed ingredients that were used: hay, corn, and high-fat dry distillers grains. I do want to say that the distillers grains used in this study were 11% fat. Many of the distillers grains out there today are running 3 to 4% fat. Okay, so in order to match the energy intake provided by 28 pounds of hay, corn was fed at 10 pounds of corn and 5 pounds of hay, and distillers grains was fed at 8.5 pounds of distillers grains and 5 pounds of hay. Why was distillers grains fed at a lower level than corn? Because this matched the energy intake. And remember that I said this corn was high fat distillers grains. So it resulted in less intake necessary relative to the corn to meet the energy intake of the animal. The initial weight of the cows on this study were about 1,335 to 1,340 pounds. The hay and the corn cows both finished at around 1,445 to 1,450 pounds. The cows that were fed the distillers grains, because it was high fat, that fat resulted in greater weight gain on the cows during mid and late gestation, is shown by a higher average daily gain. Final body condition score of the cows fed hay and corn were statistically the same, 4.9 for the hay and 5.2 for the corn versus 5.7 for the distillers grains. But what we're really interested in are the impacts on the calf through fetal programming. As we look here, the calves born from the cows that were fed hay had a birth weight of 85 pounds. The calves born from cows fed corn had 95 pounds, and from distillers grains was 91 pounds. Feeding either corn or distillers grains resulted in a greater calf birth weight compared with cows that were fed corn. There were no differences in feedlot performance, feedlot dry matter intake, or feed efficiency of the steer calves born out of these cows. However, the calves in the feedlot that were from the cows fed corn required approximately an extra 4 to 5 days in the feedlot to reach the same endpoint weight. The hot carcass weights of those steer progeny for the hay and the corn-fed calves was statistically the same. The distillers grain calves actually had a lighter carcass weight. However, what really impacts me in this is that the calves from cows that were fed hay and only hay had a greater marbling score and twice as many carcasses that were choice or high choice compared with the calves from cows supplemented with corn. Only 24% of the calves from cows supplemented with corn were average choice or higher versus 50% of the calves from cows that were just fed hay were average choice or higher. So what I want you to understand from this talk is that fetal programming and paying attention to forage digestibility is really critical. In summary, the cow's nutrition in late gestation and early lactation can be greatly impacted by protein supplementation, forage digestibility, and supplemental energy levels. Limiting protein intake or forage digestibility during mid to late gestation can dramatically impact calf performance post-weaning, as well as carcass weight and quality grade. Thank you.